Scattered across the earth are billions of people with diverse cultures, customs, values, and religions. There are many differences between them, but there is also a unifying force that helps them coexist and even cooperate. Stop on red and go on green. This simple rule of traffic guides our behavior and makes us ponder the rules of conduct we consciously or unconsciously follow every day. Different countries and communities recognize their own systems of rules. Whether those rules are social conventions or legislations based on public opinions, they restrict and regulate our lives. Despite these rules that govern everything from interpersonal to international relations, strife remains common. Different values become sources of conflict. Since unchecked freedoms invariably lead to confrontations, boundaries are needed between rights and freedoms. The rule of law is the guiding force. It is commonly presupposed to promote fairness and justice while fostering greater stability. Throughout history, philosophers have mulled over the rule of law in society and the form that it should take. Using acute observation and meticulous reasoning, lead philosopher Joseph Raz carries his own torch to face these challenges.
He was a model of a philosopher. He was just like the statues from Athens. That was how I remember thinking the first day. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Raz.
His life is bound up with the understanding that he's trying to achieve and the problems that he's confronting. And it's that rather than any sense of a body of learning.
Totally true. Totally true. When you get to know him, he is not exactly in the model of Socrates, because he's not performing a public service in the square of the town, you know. He's a professional philosopher solving puzzles, many of which never go away. Through his whole life, he struggled with some of the problems over and over and over again, because he doesn't ever feel satisfied.
He wasn't in any sense founding a school of followers, and those of us who are still working in the field have very different views to each other. His group of former students, now many of us are pretty senior, have views that are all over the map.
Raz confronts and dissects complex problems directly. He is an inventive thinker who has spent his life always critical and unwavering in the face of different trends of thought.
So from the beginning of my life as a student or as a school kid, I wasn't interested in legal philosophy specifically. I was interested in philosophy, and that's never changed. But the human is a kind of a limited animal, and mind is limited, has limited possibilities. So I'm not altogether surprised, say when I met some years ago a friend whom I have lost contact with, who knew me when I was a teenager, to hear her say, "Oh, you're still thinking about the same things that you thought about when we were at school."
Born in 1939 in Mandate, Palestine, Raz lived through a time of conflict and war in his childhood, but it didn't cast a dark shadow over his upbringing. He became interested in philosophy at age 14 and thanks his father for helping him satisfy his appetite for knowledge.
He didn't push me to do anything, but he encouraged my reading. There weren't any books at home except my books. I had the command of buying books.
Raz favored reading books on history and social studies, setting him apart from his young classmates. He subscribed to a philosophy periodical and attended community lectures even when he was a schoolboy.
There was, near where I lived, there was a a public library with an adult education center. And I just took it into my head to go to lectures there. They had lectures for adult, mostly very adult, kind of retired people who didn't have anything more to do.
Roz then enrolled in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. While other classmates focused on part-time jobs, he immersed himself in the studies of philosophies and law. After receiving a master's degree in law in 1963, on the recommendation of the provost of Hebrew University, Roz enrolled in the Doctor of Philosophy program at the University of Oxford. His advisor, the renowned legal philosopher Herbert L.A. Hart, had an immense influence on Roz's development.
I kept in touch with him, took his courses and during my studies, and at the end of them he was the one who suggested that I go to Oxford to work with Professor Hart. And he was sufficiently influential that he could arrange the scholarship.
哈特他确实是开创了英语世界法理学后来成为一个非常蓬勃发展，而且百家争鸣的一个重要研究领域啊。那其实哈特之所以能够有这样的一个贡献最主要是因为他1961年他出版了《法律的概念》这本书。这本书是一个极具开创性的一个著作，在我来看是带有一种承先启后跟继往开来的这样的一个重要的关键角色了。
His work was everywhere. There were other courses, not by him, where his work was discussed and taught. So he was a central figure.
Well, this is Kybald House, which is where Herbert Hart had his rooms. And of course, as a graduate student, Joseph would have walked along this pathway and up towards the staircase that Herbert lived on.
Roz's dear friend and former classmate from way back, Professor Peter Hacker, showed us the building where Hart worked and stayed.
And up here, Joseph would have gone when he was being supervised by Herbert. Herbert was a wonderful, wonderful supervisor. He was very critical of his students' writings and scribbled copiously on their papers, in between the lines, at the side of the lines, on the back of the piece of paper, upside down, in the most terrible handwriting you can even imagine. Nevertheless, the comments were absolutely brilliant, and he must have spent hours and hours going over the papers, thinking hard about every sentence that was written, and sometimes rewriting whole paragraphs.
And remember that in all that time he didn't teach you anything, that is, he didn't tell you what the right ideas were. He didn't make any suggestions about what your views should be. He just reacted to your work in the way that I described.
We used to meet in the evening at, I think, 8 o'clock or 8:30 in Herbert's rooms here up in Kybald House to discuss the subject in legal philosophy. And I remember John Mackey came, John Finnis came, David Hodges, the Australian legal philosopher who later became a High Court judge, he was also there. Joseph and I were there. And I don't know if I remembered Ronnie, but Ronnie was there, of course, too, Ronnie Dworkin. And I remember them as being very lively, very enjoyable. And as I say, I think it went on for 2, maybe 3 years. It was then expanded and became, and moved to All Souls. It became the very, very famous All Souls reading group. That was a much larger group, I mean, 20 to 30 people, I believe.
Roz certainly shared very fond memories with Hart. As both a mentor and model to look up to, Hart had a great impact on Roz. Roz also expressed much of his appreciation in Hart's later years.
After we graduated, Joseph's friendship with Herbert continued as a friendship between an older man and a younger one, and they were very good friends right up until Herbert's death. And indeed, in Herbert's last years, where he was in very, very poor health, Joseph behaved towards him wonderfully. I mean, he visited him frequently. He took him for drives in the countryside in his car. When Herbert was confined to a wheelchair, he pushed him around in a wheelchair. And I think he also visited him on his deathbed. I mean, he was almost a second son to Herbert. It was very moving to see how closely attached he was and how good he was to Herbert.
With Hart's guidance, Roz completed his doctorate in philosophy in 4 years. Roz went back to Hebrew University to teach for 2 years. He then returned to Oxford to hone his skills as a research fellow at Nuffield College.
This is Nuffield College, which is a college only of graduate students. There are no undergraduates here at all. And in 1970, he was elected to a visiting research fellowship here at Nuffield. And he came here in 1970, and he had a room on the right here for his first year, and later he moved across to the left-hand side of the quadrangle, and we used to meet here, of course, to talk very extensively. And at the end of his second year here at Nuffield, he got elected to a full fellowship at Balliol College and became the law fellow of Balliol, where he spent the next 20 years as law fellow and then the remaining part of his career as a professorial fellow.
Balliol, one of Oxford's oldest colleges, has been a training ground for many Nobel Prize winners and European leaders. It was here that Roz grew to become one of the world's foremost legal scholars.
What did you learn in the church?
In London's Hyde Park, two people are engaged in a heated argument. This is Speaker's Corner, a bastion of free speech that for centuries has welcomed open-air debate. Members of the audience are likewise free to speak their mind. Speaker's Corner is a symbol of the United Kingdom's early march toward democracy. In contemporary society, democracy aids the pursuit of happiness and freedom. Yet not all claims of freedom are worth preserving. Restrictions are needed, but knowing where to draw the line between individual autonomy and government authority is a complex problem.
它的法哲学里面一个很重要的命题叫依赖命题。那这个依赖命题的整个内容的表述，就是谈到人民有理由做什么，有理由过什么样的生活，那或哪些条件是人民有理由要的，所以他们可以有一个好的生活。政府施政立法一个很重要的理由，就是要增进人民的福祉。因为那是人民有的理由，很重要的一项理由。那个理由在某意义上蛮广、蛮大的一个理由。那很多细项了，就是说好的生活，那到底要具备什么样的条件？那这一项一项来想的话，那政府就有理由去做很多很多的事情，不同的事情，交通、教育、医疗。
拉兹他的一个很独特，也算是他的一个重要贡献是，他在比较早期的时候有一本重要著作《实践理由与规范》。那他在那本书里面提出了法律，他说是一种二阶的行动理由。举例来讲那个我们现在有法律规定说，骑机车要戴安全帽嘛。他说法律这样的一个规定本身就成为排除了你原本没有法律之前，你到底要不要戴安全帽骑机车的正反理由。它就变成了一个，他会讲说，原本没有法律之前的你的正反的理由会影响你的行动，那叫一阶性的理由。当法律规定出现的时候， 这个法律规定本身的存在，就构成了一个超越原本一阶理由的二阶理由。
His ideas about law come out of a picture of reason and of value, human reason, what's valuable for human beings, and the social aspect of what's valuable for human beings. It's really interesting about his career that he went about it almost in the other direction and started out on working on problems of what makes law systematic, what's a legal system, and then talking about what counts as a rule.
Because he begins by saying that the rule of law is just like the sharpness of a knife. It's an efficiency virtue, but gradually the paper moves on to explain how it might also have moral salience. And in particular, at the end, he says it's a sort of negative moral salience. It protects us against some evils that the law would otherwise bring. And that's meant to be a specifically moral view of the rule of law. So when people write about Raz and say, well, he has a thin view of the rule of law and he has a non-moral view of the rule of law, I say, you must go back and read the paper again.
A lot of us, lawyers especially, and judges, they tend to think of the rule of law as wonderfulness. and goodness, the right way things should go in a society. And Joseph said, well, if it's going to be a useful ideal, it'll be something more specific than that. What is it about a society being controlled, ruled by law that's distinctively valuable? And his answer there's a certain sort of skepticism about it. It's valuable to restrain the government, it's valuable to enable the government, but its value is quite distinct from the value of justice and from the value of respect for human rights.
Lots of the virtues of the law, when it has any, are very diverse. They are as diverse as life is, because it participates, it partakes in all aspects of our life.
The approach to the rule of law is based on everything else that we've been talking about, including the view of liberalism and the view of the approach to equality and the view of authority. This is a way in which, as Liz suggested, his thinking is systematic, because the rule of law, what he wrote about the rule of law, isn't just a coincidence. It fits into a picture of human reason.
Around the world, all governments claim to have legitimate authority and require that their subjects obey the law. Why then do conflicts and turmoil remain? What is the difference between rule of law and rule by law? When governments are incapable of being proper authorities, are people still required to blindly obey these authorities' laws and regulations?
You and I and other people have power through our property and actions. We can influence the world, not only ourselves. We can build staircases, we can do other things. But that's okay, we can understand that because we understand that the life of those people matters. But what about the government? Who cares for them? So the idea is that it doesn't matter in itself. It matters only in as much as it is of service to the governed.
它叫服务性权威，就是基本上权威的正当性来自于他有能力，而且有意愿，而且在很大程度上做到回应人民的理由。那你这个个体去服从某一个人指令，会在更大程度上让你做到你本来就有理由做的。所以你当在某个上有另外一层理由去你可以说听从或者遵守那个人给你的指示这样子。所以那这样的话，那个人才有对你来讲才有所谓的权威，否则你会问为什么要听你的
Whereas the bonds of law, as Joseph explains them in the service conception of authority, are always there for us to examine, to reflect upon, to judge. Indeed, you should never, ever comply with the rule just because it's the rule. If that traffic light is there in the middle of the desert, give it a thought. Maybe you shouldn't be stopping.
So I think it's not just about governments, it's about a whole range of nearby topics. And he's always been interested in the partial comparison of legal life with games. This goes back a long way. This is not his idea, but from his 1973 book, Practical Reason and Norms, you see this very interesting story emerging in which there are norms and then there are systems of norms. And the simplest model of a system of norms is a game, because it's autonomous. It lives within its own space in some sense that he explores. And only after he's got that picture does he move on to law, which is not autonomous, which interacts with the whole of social space. So it's important for him to make these partial comparisons.
While regulating people's behavior, the law must also protect individual freedoms. But how? Knowing where to draw the line between individual autonomy and government authority is the answer.
拉之所以第一个前提是说，自主是现代社会个人有美好人生一个非常非常关键的一个元素。就是如果你人生不是你自己选择的，那构成人生的各种的活动也好，或者重要决定很好，如果不是你自己选择的，你的人生基本上不会是美好的，是有缺陷的啦。要有自主选择呢，一个条件是要很多的自由。OK， 所以自由跟自主呢，在拉兹登哲学其实是两个不同的概念。OK， 自由你可以讲一项一项的自由，比如你有言论自由、结社自由、选择穿什么颜色衣服的自由、住哪里的自由等等之类的。
The first thing that's interesting is the idea that freedom is valuable only depending on how it's used. This is, some people are shocked by this. They say, no, I may have done something bad, but at least I did it freely. That's a good feature. And Russ says, no, if you did something bad, then the fact that you did it freely just makes it worse. That is the opposite mistake, to think that because freedom is only valuable depending on how you use it, that it isn't intrinsically valuable. No, it's valuable in itself in the sense that when you use it well, it doesn't just help you to do the right thing, it's part of doing the right thing. And so it's a very interesting middle road between two extremes in the liberal tradition.
But he came up with a view of liberalism that was in a certain way more social in its foundations, emphasizing the social nature of value, and he became skeptical of the equality principle as many other lawyers had thought of it. He was still in favor of equality, social equality as a matter of social policy. But he didn't think that that was foundational.
Over the years, I've talked to many colleagues who had the view of liberalism that Les just described, the individualistic one, and they thought that that just was what liberalism was, that it couldn't be anything else. And you know, you would start a conversation with them about this, and there would just be this brick wall of this individualistic conception about what liberalism had to be. And I would say to people, well, but you should read Joseph Raz, and that he'll turn all of that inside out and upside down for you.
When Joseph writes about the morality of freedom, it took me a long time to realize that he didn't think that morality had to involve freedom. This was just the morality of a free culture. Yeah. Not all cultures are free, and they don't necessarily need to be free, but this is the culture that many people in the world today inhabit. And if you wanted to live it well, then this is what you need to do.
The ability to choose is a psychological personality which can cope with the pressure of choice and with the opportunities to choose, may take advantage of them, and of course requires the cultural and economic background which offers opportunities to develop life in different directions at different times.
Raz published many classics in the field of jurisprudence, including The Authority of Law, The Morality of Freedom, and Practical Reason and Norms. In these publications, he gave us his greatest effort of displaying the truest form of law. At the invitation of the Tang Prize Foundation, Raz participated in the Masters Forum at Taiwan's National Zhengzhi University.
I will go in your order, as it is. I will start with commenting on your paper and then proceed to the rule of law issue.
Raz offered his views on papers presented by other professors participating in the forum. He engaged them in a logic-based and also earnest discussion that is very familiar to his former students.
You know, I used to remember writing things for him and doing my very best and thinking that it was good enough. And then as I walked to his room, I gradually realized that it wasn't. And then very gradually...
You were lucky. You were lucky. You realized before you got there.
Well, sometimes I did. I came to.
And I was not so lucky as Tim. I never realized until I was in the room how stupid I was. Right? When I was in the room, I realized, because he would find some sentence.
Yeah.
And usually, sometimes it was the second or the third sentence, and you would spend the whole hour working on this. And at the end, you would say, "So what do you think I should do?" And his answer was always the same. He would always say, "It's your thesis." So he never told you what your next step was. He just alerted you to the problems in the step you already took.
I had that on my first encounter with him in a doctoral supervision. And he asked me about one sentence, and we spent 2 hours on the sentence. And you back up, as one does when one's challenged, and then he'd push you a little farther. And then you back up a little more, and you were trying to back through the wall behind you. And I remember walking away from that and thinking, he'd taken me on as a student, and I realized that I hadn't done what I needed to do. And I thought, I probably have one more crack at this. I've got to get it right the next time. This can't happen again. And so this was sort of right from the very beginning, imposing a very high standard on you. But as John says, without any guidance as to how to meet it, there's the bar. Now, I'll show you roughly where it lies. Now, you've got to get over it, and you've got to figure out how to get over it.
He was not in any way directional, either in terms of directing what topic or even reading. And sometimes it happened to me that he had written something pertinent to what I was writing on, but he hadn't mentioned it. I found my way to his reading. He never directed it. So
I don't think he ever told me to read anything that he'd written.
Never, never. He never did, even when it was directly on point. So his approach was responsive to our work and to our development. So he let us develop in whatever direction we wanted, and he was always there to respond, and respond quickly and insightfully and incisively.
He wasn't making us into members of a school. Almost the opposite.
Yeah.
Almost the opposite. And it was very clear in our relationship that I had to write something and he had to read it.
Yeah.
And that was the extraordinary part, because he would read what I wrote. And with that remarkable intelligence, and demolish it. He would demolish what I wrote.
Yeah.
And I would go out of his room with nothing left and write something else, and he'd meet me again, and I'd go out of his room with nothing left from what I'd written. And this was an extraordinary positive experience. It changed my whole perspective on what I was trying to do.
Joseph is interested in all of life and people in particular, and so as a student of his, he was interested in what we were doing outside of our work as well. So he was a curious, interested person, and a gentle and supportive one as well.
Roz is friendly and respectful in his interactions with people. He encourages others to develop their own ideologies and is open to dissenting views, but he demands that his students achieve high standards in their academic pursuits and defend the positions they believe in.
In his academic work and in supervision, he had zero tolerance for sloppy thinking and sloppy writing.
He had no tolerance for sloppiness, but he also had no tolerance for, schools of thought in the sense of people just following along because this is the club and they wanted to be a member of the club.
Because the approach he took to our work, he would actually read it seriously and point out where it was fundamentally misguided, if it was, and it's the same approach that he took to his own work.
Yeah.
I never at any point saw any indication of his wanting to defend something that he had written because he'd written it. Not at all.
He was self-critical. As people in the profession will know, he set his mind against some of his early work in his very first influential book and changed his mind on some important things.
It's not that I'm interested in challenging myself. That's not a goal.
It's not a goal, okay.
It's just that I'm not. I take two things for granted. One is that it's imperfect. And secondly, that not only can't I make it perfect, that is, it will remain imperfect however much it is improved, but there is no chance of convincing everyone of the value in it, even to the extent that it has value.
That is to say, he wasn't writing in order to garner an audience, in order to establish a reputation for himself. He was writing what he wrote because he thought it was correct, because he thought it illuminated the subject.
Maybe the best thing I've learned from him is that there's a difficulty about doing philosophical work. You work away and you read what other people have written and you think about, and you've got an idea, and then you get to the hard part where you have to clarify and be specific about what you're actually saying. And it's much easier to go and have a cup of coffee and to write something that's a bit woolly and leaves it open, and you hope the reader will be charitable and understand what you're trying to do. And that's not good enough, and Joseph wouldn't rest with that, and he wouldn't put up with it from us. To say something open-ended that covers up the difficult part.
One of the things that I feel now that I inherited from Joseph is that when I start writing about a subject, I don't know where I'm going to end up. So many people, especially who work in political philosophy, have an idea about the position that they will reach, and they make the arguments work to defend the position. I don't like to do that, and I think Joseph taught me, no, just work, and maybe you reach the opposite conclusion from what you imagined.
Yeah.
That's the conclusion.
So it isn't that you come to a project and you say, I have an idea about that, or I'm looking for an idea. That would be a mistake.
Yeah.
You start with a sense of problem. The only thing I've learned over the years is to go a little bit beyond that, because I used to work through a project by having a problem to solve, and I didn't know where I was going.
Yeah.
If you don't know where you're going, then the reader doesn't know where you're going either, and that's a big act of faith.
That's why you need to do a second draft.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was very much a singular intellect, and he was more interested in getting to the bottom of whatever he wanted to think about and come to terms with than he was interested in what the world was going to make of it. As it turned out, because the work is so good, the world responded well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But that's not what he was ever after. He just wanted to get the thought right.
Raz follows a strict argumentative process that avoids putting the conclusion ahead of the argument used to reach it. Enlightened by the teaching style of his mentor Hart, Raz has taught students at Oxford University, King's College London, and Columbia Law School over the course of more than half a century, passionately as always. He maintains a sensitive and rigorous approach to philosophical topics and discussions.
After I had finished my doctoral research, I ended up sometimes staying with him, especially in New York. And his routine in New York was very interesting. It taught me something about philosophical work. He would get up in the morning well before anybody else, and he would write very hard and very fast. You'd hear the keys of the keyboard, you know, and then he would stop completely. And then most of the day, he would walk around Manhattan, take photographs, go to an exhibition, do that, come back late afternoon and do it all again, very hard and very fast, for 2 or 3 hours. And he was working very intensively, but not for the whole day.
Yeah.
He really needed, you know, he's a guy with wide interests. So he had other things he wanted to do. And no doubt those things were helping him to solve the problems, because he was thinking as he walked around.
And I think it's unusual, quite unusual, for somebody to be so deeply committed to a field for such a long period of time. So this has been going on for 50 years and more, and I haven't noticed any slackening of commitment.
Raz has dedicated his life to shedding light on society's fundamental issues, endlessly working to solve difficult questions. He has advised countless students, earning their respect as he offered them motivations to work toward answering deep philosophical questions. These former students have become worldwide pioneers in fields of philosophy, law, and politics. They have a wide spectrum of viewpoints that often are at odds with Raz's own views. but they all rely on a common foundation provided by their teacher. Roz picked up his camera to playfully gather images of the news team sent to interview him. Photography is Roz's primary hobby.
Photography, as you know, is a very popular occupation, and you get a sense of satisfaction, even though you shouldn't, because you take bad photographs. But sometimes you think, oh, that's quite nice. I've never done something like that before. It's
the beauty of the photo.
It's trees, and I like trees. The trees break the light and create complex image, of complex pattern of light on ground, leaves on the trees, on the branches of the trees.
Roz lights up at the mention of photography, excitedly discussing his passion. He began this hobby 25 years ago and is still very enthusiastic about it. With his students spread across the world, Roz has many opportunities to shoot in all corners of life.
He came to visit me there in this very small town in the far north. I think not so much because he wanted to see me, but because he wanted to photograph the tundra. And he took fantastic photographs of the Arctic landscape.
A former student came to visit me and said, he was teaching in Utah in America, and he said, will you come and give us a paper? And I said, I'll give you a paper if you take me to this canyon.
Oh, okay.
So this was outrageous to make the suggestion, but I did it.
Roz is warm and considerate. When we needed to record a scene, he gladly helped us with the lighting. At times, it was easy to forget that this person is a leading thinker in legal philosophy. Roz, who is 79, is mostly at his London flat. His walls are covered in black and white photos taken by himself or famed photographers. Close friends are fully aware of Roz's hobby. Roz even took a portrait of Hart that was used in a book Roz and Hacker wrote to commemorate their mentor. Whenever there is something visually captivating in life, he will rush for his camera and capture the scene.
So he's a very accomplished photographer, and he took this up in midlife, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, and
built a darkroom.
He took it very, very serious. So there's an interesting parallel between his academic work and his non-academic work. He took photography as seriously as he took.
Here is one which nobody likes except me, because I liked it again because of the distribution of the light, the structures. It's very angular and sharp. But the point about it is, of course, it's made with iPhone, so it shows what opportunities the technology has opened for us nowadays.
Professor, can you show us the equipment?
You want to see the iPhone?
Roz has a great sense of humor. While cracking jokes with the news team, he shared camera techniques and discussed photography. Other than photography, he also goes online to read the news and other articles like the rest of us.
He's a guy who likes some fun. He really likes to gossip and to chat about all sorts of diverse subjects. But when the conversation turns to philosophy, that's when it all gets serious. No more joking. Yeah. So this was always a little bit of an issue with me, because I like to joke about philosophy too. So my joking continued, and he would be very stern and say, "This is serious now."
And this is difficult because most of our everyday conversation about politics or society or whatever is conducted at a less than rigorous level. And that's just fine. And that's how it should be for most people most of the time. But it's not right for a philosopher. So he will switch from the one being to another. He can talk about gossip, or he can do philosophy, but if he's doing philosophy, he does it seriously. This is true even when he talks politics. You know, if I'm talking politics, I've mostly got it out of the paper. Whereas Joseph is very well informed, and he knows everything about something before he will start to venture opinion on it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it becomes part of the philosophy.
It becomes part of the philosophy than the gossip, yeah.
No matter what Roz is engaged in, whether he is at ease or stern, thinking or talking, his mind always seems to trace back to philosophy. His hard-working nature and love of exploration are even apparent in his photographing habits. These seemingly trivial traits are all part of what led him to reach the pinnacle of philosophical studies.
Please present the Tang Prize Medal.
The first winner of the Tang Prize for Rule of Law, former South African Constitutional Court Justice Albie Sachs, presented the 2018 prize to Roz. Unlike Sachs, Roz has not achieved direct successes in the courtroom or legal practice, but his scholastic outputs on legal, moral, and political philosophies have had an enormous influence on contemporary legal practitioners and scholars.
I think he's one of the 2 or 3 greatest legal philosophers of the century. I think he's made very important contributions to legal and moral philosophy, and that he will determine debates for some decades to come.
There are a lot of contemporary worries to which Joseph's work is relevant, and just to pick a very prominent one, we might worry about the rise of the loose ideology of populism.
Law acquired a status and an import in the 20th century that it lacked before.
Yes.
And it's a much broader, much more political. It's not necessarily liberal, but it is much more fluid, open-ended, forward-looking than the other ways of articulating common purpose. So I think this comes out from Joseph's work, and I think, as John says, it is an alternative to populism.
I think it's interesting now that the Tang Prize has been awarded to him, given the depth of his work on the rule of law, because of course this deep work is so relevant, and relevant in an ongoing way to sorting out these problems that of course we're facing today with democratic decay occurring all across the world. But you can look to Joseph's work, which was written about the nature of the principle and its implications, and draw great insights from it.
He just broke down those kinds of debates and said, no, there's a whole new platform on which these discussions can and should be taking place. And so he opened up a huge number of philosophical issues for renewed discussion that had been becoming somewhat dead-endish.
Yeah.
In his writings on legal, political, and moral topics, Roz is like a trekker who tirelessly treads and finds new paths across these 3 densely packed mountaintops. He responds to questions such as, what is law? Why do people need to obey the law? And what is the meaning of the rule of law? Following in his footsteps, you can also find your own answers to these questions.